Okay, what we're going to do here is we're going to tell the story about a book here. There's a story within this book. This is a book, Dunnellon Boomtown of the 1890s by J. Lester Dinkins, who is a friend of ours and just phenomenally cool guy and good researcher. He did extensive research on this. And I'll have to tell the story as it's gone because it's just a fascinating story with many elements to it. I've read this book over the years many times. I probably have a half dozen copies of this. I've given many away. The Dunnellon Boomtown is so many fascinating elements to it. One of the stories that Mr. Dinkins writes about here is the double murder at Juliet that happened of Turner and Barfield. Juliet is now Rainbow Springs. The general store at Juliet was somewhere around the location of where the lodge or the gift shop is at the top of the hill up at Rainbow Springs. Back during that time, there was a general store and a hotel there. The shopkeepers were obviously Turner and Barfield. They had a general store. They knew pretty much everyone. It was a smaller commercial area because Dunnellon was booming at that time. Most of the commercial district was in Dunnellon. But some of the local farmers along the river shopped at their store. In 1895, there was both murdered. Now, a lot of the story is lost, but what is known is Turner was at the front desk. Two black men knocked on the door after hours. They let them in. They obviously knew who they were. They let them into shop, even though it was after hours. Because it was after hours, Barfield went to the safe because he had to make change. They shot him in the back as the safe swung open, and they shot the other shopkeeper point blank at the front counter. Folks heard the shots from a distance and came to inquire, and they found the shopkeepers shot dead. This is known. From there's a lot of ambiguity. We didn't have DNA science. An investigation was done. A witness said that they saw two black men leaving the scene. They formed a posse, and they went looking for the black men. They did not find them immediately. Now, I have to piece together the story from Mr. Dinkins' book and another book written by Judge E.C. May, which is our primary source for that era. Both of them mention the murders of Turner and Barfield. I had read the story many times, and I had not really thought that much about it. It was just a story of the past. And when my son was old enough to learn to read, he was about kindergarten age, I would randomly just pick up books off the shelf and open it up and read them stories from whatever page we opened us, just to teach him to read. And one time I picked up the book, Mr. Dinkins' book, and I started reading them about the murder of Turner and Barfield. And right in the middle of it, I got this really odd sensation, and I'm like, oh, that name sounds very familiar. But I wasn't sure. I went directly up to the attic, rummaged through all my historical artifacts, and it was kind of a strange moment. I had in my historical artifact collection a receipt signed by J.B. Barfield, November of the year before he was killed during the double murder there. And so I had a direct connection to that. The rest of the story is, back during that era, malaria was a common element. It was so common, basically everyone had malaria. And during different seasons, as the weather changed, people with malaria would get fevers. And it was not uncommon for people with malaria and they had fever would just lay down in the shade and just sweat off their fever. I mean, that was just a normal way down in malarial Florida. And so there was a black man, he was in Juliet, and some of the folks, right, short time after the murder, and some folks were walking by, and he seemed to be just sweating out the fever. He was laying in the shade. He had his eyes closed. He appeared to be just resting from the fever. But as somebody walked by, they noticed his eyes were open, and he was watching people. He was kind of playing possum, you might say. He was pretending like he had a fever, but he was laying there watching people. When they investigated, they decided he was trying to figure out what they knew. So they arrested him and they investigated, and it was determined that he was one of the robbers. He confessed to another, and then there was a whole lot of hell broke loose. Ultimately, he was hung. His accomplice was hung. There was another accomplice that supposedly had prior knowledge that was almost lynched in Dunnellon. Another part of that story is Judge May, who was a merchant in Dunnellon, was in New York City. He went once a year for an annual to purchase his merchandise. He would do all his purchases and then have them shipped back to Dunnellon. He would buy them at auction and have a year's worth of his major buys sent by rail back to Dunnellon. And in the New York Times, he read about the double murder at Juliet while he was waiting for the train at the train station. He got on the train, came straight through to Dunnellon, very long ride from New York at that time. And the train pulled into Juliet after coming straight through from New York. And there was a stopover as he had to change trains for the short ride into Dunnellon. And there was a mob at this train station in Juliet. When he went to investigate, they were preparing to lynch another young black man. And as Judge May recounts, he says he knew him, and he said he was a good kid. So he stepped in front of the mob, and they were ready to lynch him. And he asked the young man, he says, "What's up with this?" He says, "Where were you?" And the young man told him, he says, "I was working at Port Inglis the night of the killing." Judge May was able to put off the mob. They sent a rider to go to Port Inglis and to check with Captain Inglis to see if this young man was there. They waited it out. They waited for the rider to go to Inglis to communicate with him, asked Captain Inglis. Captain Inglis confirmed that he was working that night, and it was too long a trip for him to be able to come from Inglis, commit the crime, and then get back to Inglis. There was just not enough time, so he proved. So Judge May was able to save that young man's life. Eventually, that situation really spiraled out of control. Eventually, it was so out of control that they had to spend a special train from Ocala with reinforcements to calm the riot conditions in Dunnellon after that double murder. And I had known that for many years and had a document signed by J.B. Barfield in my attic for 10 years without piecing it together until I was reading that story to my son, and I pieced it together at that time. Fascinating piece of old Florida. There was multiple lynchings. There was the one lynching that was averted, and of course there was the double murder up there of Turner and Barfield.